Hello and welcome to this video of Inside Stream. I am Dr. Manmohan Radhesham Yadav, and in this video I will be talking about the declining dominance of the US dollar and the historical data that suggests the same. So let us start. In the year 1944, delegates from 44 allied nations have gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Inside a room, they were about to make a decision that would shape the global economy for the next 80 years. Britain, the then world's financial superpower for over 2 centuries, has gone broke. And the reason was the World War II. Its national debt had grown to up to 249% of its GDP. After two very devastating world wars, the empire that once ruled the seas, the empire in which the sun never set, was now financially exhausted, and everyone who was present in that particular conference knew that. So, there was something that had to be done in order to restore the financial stability of the world. So, they decided to transfer the global reserve currency status from one empire to another. The British pound sterling, the one dominant currency in the world, now a currency of a nation that is debt ridden, was transferred to the American dollar. But this simply wasn't a transfer of financial power, it was a continuation of a pattern that had repeated itself for almost past 5 centuries. A cycle that is very predictable. The rise of a currency, the peak, the overextension of an economy, and its collapse. Every world reserve currency in the past had followed the same cycle. Now it is the US dollar that is showing the same warning signs that preceded every currency before it. In order to understand what may happen in the future, we will have to go back in time to learn about the history of the previous currencies. In 1450, the Portuguese real became the world's first true reserve currency, and for about 80 years, Portugal dominated the global trade. This wasn't luck. Portugal had revolutionized navigation and global commerce by finding new routes to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. After the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, the old spice routes were captured by hostile powers. And it was Portugal that found a way around it by sailing around Africa and opening a new age of discovery. Lisbon became the center of the trading world. The Portuguese real was accepted across the continents Europe, Africa, Asia. And at its peak, the Portugal's empire stretched across Africa, India, Malaysia, Japan, and even into the China through Macau. But as always, success led to overreach. Maintaining military positions on four continents was a massive drain on Portugal's treasury. Competition from the Dutch, the British, the French had started growing fierce, and the royal succession crisis in 1530s led to the destabilization of the Portuguese kingdom. By 1580, Spain had absorbed Portugal into the Iberian Union. The Portuguese real had ruled the world trade for 80 years, and then it was simply gone. It was replaced by the Spanish silver. The rise of Spain began with the discovery of the richest silver deposit in the world by then. The mountain of Potsi High in Bolivia Andes, discovered in 1545, was a silver mine that allowed the Portuguese to produce nearly half of the world's silver between 1575 to 1635. The Spanish Empire minted these pieces of 8 in pottery mint marked by with the letter P. These coins became the first truly global currency. The Spanish dollar became the first stable and trusted coin in the Western world. And from the 16th to the 19th century, it even served as a legal tender in the United States until 1857. Spain's dominance lasted roughly 110 years, from 1530s to the 1640s. But then the pattern appeared again: overextension and crushing debt. Charles I left his son Philip II a mountain of debt, 36 million ducats, with an annual deficit of another 1 million. Philip II defaulted on Spain's loans on four separate occasions, starting with 1557, then 1560, 1575, and lastly in the year 1596. The endless flow of new world silver created a massive inflation in prices. The prices in Spain quadrupled during his reign. The supply of silver dropped by half under Philip III. Spain's economy crumbled. Bankruptcy followed, and by the year 1641, the Iberian Union fell apart, and the Spain's monetary dominance of the world ended. The new financial power was rising, and this time it was the Dutch Republic. In 1600s, Amsterdam became the world's leading financial hub. The Dutch guilda, backed by innovation and trade, emerged as Europe's de facto reserve currency. The Bank of Amsterdam introduced efficient, trustworthy systems for international payments. Dutch merchants and investors pioneered modern finance itself. They created the world's first stock exchange, marine insurance, and new instruments like acceptance credit and publicly traded company shares. From the year 1642 till 1720, roughly for 78 years, the Dutch guilder dominated the world trade, accounting for more than a third of all international transactions. But even the Dutch fell into the same trap. Military overreach, especially during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War from 1780 till 1784, bankrupted the country. The Dutch East India Company collapsed under the strain of its conflicts with the British, and by the late 1700s, Britain had risen to take its place. The British pound sterling, backed by the Industrial Revolution, the industrial power of Britain, and vast colonial empire, became the next global reserve currency for over next 2 centuries, starting from 1720s to 1944. It ruled the world trade together and longer than any currency in modern history. At the height of its dominance, the British Empire ruled over 60% of the world trade, and all this trade was invoiced in British pounds. London was a global hub for insurance, commodities, and investments. The gold standard strengthened the pound's supremacy, and after the Great Recoinage of 1816, the Britain's currency was considered the most stable on earth. By the year 1922, the British Empire controlled almost 458 million people, almost one-fifth of the world's population, and a quarter of its landmass. The British financial power seemed unbreakable. Then again, we see the familiar decline. World War I started. The Britain's national debt, starting from 650 million pounds in 1914, ballooned to over 7 billion pounds by the year 1919, when the World War I ended. The Second World War was even more devastating for the British economy. World War II starting in the year 1939, and by the year 1945, the British government debt reached 270% of its GDP. The British Empire had won the war, but its financial crown was lost. And that brings us to the Bretton Woods Conference in the year 1944. Over 700 delegates from 44 allied nations gathered between July the 1st and July 22nd to rebuild the global financial system. Their agreement created the International Monetary Fund, also known as the IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which we now know as the World Bank. The Bretton Woods system tied every major currency to the US dollar, and the US dollar itself was tied to gold at the rate of $30 per ounce of gold. The transition from pound to dollar was now official. For the next quarter century, the US dollar reigned supreme until 1971. It was in this year when the US President Richard Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The gold standard was abandoned by the US government, but the dollar continued. It didn't collapse. Instead, it found a new basis, and that was oil. After the 1973 OPEC oil crisis, the US government struck a strategic deal with the government of Saudi Arabia. In exchange for military protection, Saudi oil will be priced and sold exclusively in the US dollar. By the year 1975, every OPEC member had agreed to do the same. Thus, the petrodollar system was born because every country needs oil. Therefore, every country needs US dollars. This artificial global demand allowed the US to run a massive deficit that would have crushed any other nation's currency. For decades, the US dollar's dominance was unquestioned. And at its peak in the year 2000, over 70% of the world's foreign exchange reserves were held in US dollars, but now the numbers are changing. By the year 2024, this figure had fallen to 58%. Foreign investors' share of US Treasury has dropped from over 50% during the 2008 financial crisis to just about 30% in the early 2025. The process of de-dollarization is accelerating. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates together. They are building a financial system that bypasses the US dollar entirely. As of 2025, 10 BRICS members and 13 partner nations are developing the BRICS Bridge payment network to settle the transactions using the central bank digital currencies of the member nations. Meanwhile, the America's own balance sheet is under strain. As on March 6, 2025, the US public debt stood at 29 trillion US dollars, a trillion with a T, with another 7.4 trillion in governmental holdings. The total debt rises to 36.4 trillion US dollars. It's almost 124% of the US GDP. And it is here that we see the historical pattern starting to repeat itself once more. In the past, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the British all followed the same pattern, lasting between 78 to 220 years, averaging about 95 years. The US dollar has been the reserve currency of the world for 81 years since the Bretton Woods Conference, and now we are approaching a historical turning point, the historical average for which, up to which, a global currency lasts. Every reserve currency in the past has passed through the four stages: rise, peak, overextension, and collapse. The first stage is always the rise. A nation gains dominance through innovation, either in trade, finance, or military strength. The Portuguese mastered global navigation. The Spanish flooded the world with silver. The Dutch built a modern financial system. Britain, through its industrial revolution, shaped the global trade. The Americas rose through the post war industrial might and military strength. Then comes the second stage, the peak. At this stage, the reserve currency becomes nearly universal. In other words, accepted by almost all the nations all over the world. It is generally used for more than 50% of the global trade. The empire seems untouchable. Then the third stage starts, overextension of the nation. This is where the cracks start to appear. Massive military costs, increasing debt, and declining productivity of the national economy. The Portuguese, the Portuguese Empire, which had stretched across four continents, the Spanish, who defaulted repeatedly four times, the Dutch bankrupted themselves while fighting the British, and the British, who increased their debt to almost 270% of the GDP while fighting two world wars, is a historical precedent. The US today carries debt at 124% of the GDP, and it has spent 8 trillion on Middle East wars alone. Now comes the fourth stage, collapse. Reserve currency status of a currency is starting to wane. Currency is starting to lose trust, and power is starting to shift. Every empire in the past has faced this reckoning. So, what comes next? History can offer us some clues. The Portuguese never regained their influence. The Spanish conquest in 1580s, despite their immense wealth from the Americas, it fell into decline. The Netherlands remained a prosperous nation, but it was reduced to a regional power. The British, although a wealthy nation, but it saw its empire decline and later dissolve, and its global dominance fading after the year 1945. By 1950s, 55% of the global reserve was still held in British pound sterling, but within 2 decades, that share dropped sharply. The British century ended and the American century began. But the transition like this doesn't happen overnight. Britain's decline took decades. Coming to the US overtook Britain economically long before the US dollar replaced the British pound as a dominant currency. The same slow shift may be appearing again, this time with China emerging along with other multipolar centers of power all over the world. Every reserve currency's lifespan has averaged around 95 years. The US dollar is now in its 81st year. The signs are there, the signs are all too familiar. Declining global share from 70% to 58%, shrinking foreign treasury demand, the alternative in the form of BRICS rising, petrodollar agreements fading, and overextended military presence of 900 military bases in 130 countries. The pattern has defined the past 5 centuries of economic history, and it is again repeating itself. The only question left is that how fast the transition will unfold and who will lead the next financial era. Will it be a gradual shift like Britain's slow descent and then its reduction as a local regional power, or it will be like the Dutch, which collapsed overnight? Will there be a single new power that would emerge to replace the US dollar, or will the future be a multipolar one where several reserve currencies are sharing the global influence, which might include China, Russia, India, and Brazil? History doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but it certainly rhymes. And if this rhyme holds true, we are nearing the final verses of the dollar's dominance. Thank you, and thank you for listening to this video. I will be posting another video regarding the increasing demand for the gold all over the world very soon. Thank you.